Snow had been drifting over the city since early afternoon, soft and persistent, as though the sky had decided to wrap the world in a blanket of silence just for one night. Inside St. Aurelia's Hospital, Dr. Helena Ward moved through the fluorescent corridors with the quiet precision of someone who had long ago learned to carry her exhaustion like another layer beneath her white coat. She had grown used to Christmas Eve shifts, the emptier hallways, the dimmed lights, the muted murmurs of patients whose loneliness echoed faintly against the walls. But tonight felt heavier, its stillness pressing against her ribs, as if reminding her how long she had been moving through life on autopilot. The city beyond the frosted windows glowed with festive warmth she could no longer feel. The decorations, the distant laughter, the cheesy carols, all of it seemed like it belonged to a world that had forgotten her, or one she had quietly stepped out of without noticing. Helena paused by the window at the end of the corridor, watching snowflakes swirl in spirals of white gold under the streetlights, and wondered, not for the first time, when her life had narrowed to this, a rhythm of healing others while refusing to acknowledge the quiet fractures within herself. The night should have remained uneventful, a few patients, a few routine emergencies, but life, she knew, rarely listened to such expectations. And when the doors to the emergency room burst open with a rush of cold air and frantic voices, her heart jolted, not with fear, but with an instinctive readiness she had cultivated over years of stitching broken bodies and steadying frightened breathing. The paramedics wheeled in a man she had never seen before, mid-30s, shivering violently despite his soaked coat, his skin pale from the cold, his fingers curled around something he refused to let go of, even in his unconsciousness. Helena leaned over him and saw the corner of a letter protruding from his fist, the envelope worn at the edges as if carried for a very long time. His name, she would learn moments later, was Elias, a soft sound, almost fragile, nothing like the storm that had delivered him to her. As she worked to stabilize him, she felt a subtle but unmistakable pull, not of attraction, but of recognition, as though the sorrow radiating from him resonated with a part of her she kept carefully hidden beneath professionalism and well-rehearsed detachment. The hospital hummed around them, machines blinking in slow rhythm, nurses moving like shadows through quiet hallways. But to Helena, everything felt suspended, held in a fragile balance between duty and something more tender she didn't yet understand. She wondered who the letter was for, what weight it carried, why he had clung to it even as consciousness slipped away. She wondered, too, why the sight of him stirred an ache she had not felt in years, an ache that did not belong to romance or desire, but to something older, the longing to be seen by another soul who might understand the shape of her loneliness. When Elias finally opened his eyes, disoriented and breathless, his gaze met hers with a depth that startled her, like someone who had been walking through grief for so long that light itself had begun to feel unfamiliar. Helena did not ask questions. She simply stood beside him, steady and quiet, allowing the room to settle around his fragile awakening. And in the hush of that moment, she felt the first subtle shift in the air, a shift that whispered that this night, this patient, this snow-filled hour would not remain just another entry in the hospital logbook. It was the beginning of something neither of them had expected, something neither of them had sought, and though neither yet understood it, the first star had already begun its silent descent toward them. a star that would change the course of a single night, and perhaps the shape of both their lives. For a long while after Elias regained consciousness, the room held the kind of quiet that feels alive. A quiet woven from unasked questions, restrained breaths, and the delicate uncertainty of two strangers bound together by circumstance. Helena checked his vitals with steady hands, but her mind kept drifting back to the envelope, still clutched loosely in his fingers. It lay on the blanket between them now, its edges torn and softened by time, the ink on the front slightly blurred, as though carried through years of weather and wandering. She tried not to stare, but the letter seemed to pulse with significance, a small, fragile anchor holding him to something or someone far beyond the hospital walls. Elias watched her with an expression caught between gratitude and embarrassment, as though waking in a stranger's care forced him to confront a tenderness he wasn't sure he deserved. His voice, when he finally spoke, was quiet and rough around the edges, shaped by cold air and something older, something heavier. He apologized for the trouble, for the snow, for taking up space he didn't intend to occupy. The kind of apology spoken by people who have spent too long believing their existence is an inconvenience. Helena didn't interrupt. She simply listened, sensing instinctively that to rush him would be akin to tugging too sharply at a wound still raw. As the storm outside thickened, its wind throwing handfuls of snow against the windows, the conversation between them grew in small, cautious steps. Elias offered fragments of explanation that he had walked for miles through the snow, that he hadn't meant to collapse, that the letter had been meant for someone he hadn't seen in many years. But each admission seemed to close him off as much as it opened him, as though he feared saying too much would unravel him entirely. Helena could have pressed. Her training had taught her how to navigate confessions far more painful than this, and yet she hesitated. Something about him made her want to allow space rather than take it. The nurses drifted in and out, adjusting machines, offering warm blankets, their presence softening the sterile edges of the room. Helena remained even after her tasks were complete, telling herself she was monitoring his condition, though a small part of her knew she was staying for reasons she wasn't ready to name. She felt drawn to the way Elias stared at the falling snow, with a mixture of longing and dread, as if the quiet white world outside reminded him of both a memory he cherished and a loss he feared to touch. Eventually, she asked whether he wanted her to leave the letter on the bedside table, but he shook his head, fingers tightening around it with a subtle desperation. It was not the grip of a man holding onto paper. It was the grip of someone holding onto the last thread, connecting him to a story he wasn't sure he was strong enough to finish. Helena recognized that kind of grip. She had seen it in waiting rooms, in families receiving impossible news, and once, painfully, in her own reflection after a Christmas long past. The snow outside softened into a quieter fall, thickening the night with a hush that made the hospital feel suspended in time. Elias's breathing grew steadier, and Helena sensed exhaustion pulling him back toward sleep. Before drifting off, he whispered almost to himself, "I didn't think I'd ever get here." She wanted to ask where here truly meant, the hospital, the city, this moment, but the question lodged in her throat. Something told her he wasn't speaking of geography at all. As the lights dimmed and his eyes closed, Helena felt an unexpected ache bloom in her chest. It wasn't romantic, not yet, not even fully formed. It was something more delicate, the recognition of another soul standing at a crossroads, trembling yet determined. The kind of ache that whispers that lives do not intersect by accident. Elias slept, the letter resting against his chest like a fragile heartbeat, and Helena, sitting quietly beside him, wondered, for the first time in years, whether this night held a purpose she had not yet begun to understand. The storm worsened as midnight approached, yet inside the small hospital room, time seemed to settle into a slower, heavier rhythm, as if the world outside were deliberately holding its breath for the two souls inside. Helena sat in the dim glow of the bedside lamp, reviewing charts she had already read twice, pretending to stay out of duty, even though something deeper anchored her to that chair. Elias, still half asleep, shifted slightly, the mysterious letter slipping from his fingers just long enough for Helena to catch it before it hit the floor. For a moment she simply held it, feeling the ghost of someone else's words pressed between the folds. She set it back gently, but the brief contact left her with a strange turbulence, the kind that arises when a truth tries to surface before you're ready to see it. She reminded herself that people carry all kinds of letters, final goodbyes, confessions, pleas for forgiveness. Yet something in her whispered that this one was different, not just because Elias guarded it like something holy, but because of the way his eyes softened whenever they drifted toward it, as if he were looking not at ink on paper, but at a doorway into a life he'd never stopped longing for. When he finally woke again, the storm outside had reached its violent crescendo, sheets of snow sweeping past the window in frantic waves. Elias blinked slowly, as though returning from a dream that had followed him all the way from the past. His first instinct was to check for the letter. When he saw it resting safely by his side, he exhaled in relief, so quiet it felt like a confession in itself. Helena wanted to tell him he didn't need to guard it so fiercely, but she sensed that the story behind it was one that required more courage to hold than to speak. They talked again, this time more openly, though still in half-thoughts and gentle pauses. He asked her why she was still there, why she hadn't gone home hours ago, and she answered honestly before she had time to soften it. "I didn't feel like leaving." The room felt smaller then, warmer, as if her words had shifted something subtle between them. For the first time, Elias allowed himself to truly look at her, the weariness behind her strength, the quiet resilience in the way she spoke, the fear she hid behind a practiced calm. The snow pounded against the glass, as though urging them forward, urging them to let go of the defenses they'd spent years perfecting. Elias rubbed a hand over his face and admitted he had come here tonight, not because he was lost, but because he could no longer keep running from the message inside the letter. It was something he had promised to deliver, a promise made long ago, under a Christmas sky that once felt full of magic. But when Helena gently asked whether he intended to deliver it now, his silence revealed everything: fear, grief, guilt, and a longing for closure he did not believe he deserved. Helena felt something soften in her chest, a quiet, almost painful empathy. She realized he wasn't a wanderer. He was a man trying desperately to return to a part of his life he believed he had ruined. And perhaps she stayed not just out of concern, but because she recognized the shape of regret in him, a shape she herself had carried for years. The hospital lights flickered as the wind howled, and for a moment It seemed the two of them were suspended in a world made only of snow and the faint rhythm of their breathing. Elias's hand brushed against the envelope by accident, and he flinched as if touched by something electric. Helena reached forward, not to take it, but to steady it beside him, a small gesture, yet one that told him he did not have to face whatever was inside alone. He met her eyes, and the storm outside seemed to fade into something distant. For the first time that night, he whispered her name, and Helena understood, without needing explanations, that this was the moment their stories began to intertwine, delicately, cautiously, like two lights flickering into existence in the heart of a winter storm. The storm began to ease after midnight, but inside the small hospital room the tension only deepened, stretching like a fine thread between the two of them. Elias sat upright now, the pallor in his face replaced by something sharper, not fear, not grief, but a kind of restless determination that made Helena feel as though they were standing at the edge of something irreversible. The mysterious letter lay on the blanket between them, a thin white shape carrying a weight far greater than paper should be able to hold. Helena wanted to ask again what it meant to him, but she sensed that pressing too soon would cause him to retreat, to slide back behind the silence he had wrapped around himself like a shield. Instead, she waited, letting the quiet settle, letting the storm's fading rumble remind them both that time was still moving forward, even if they felt suspended in place. Elias finally reached for the envelope, holding it as though it were a fragile relic of a life he no longer knew how to claim. He confessed in a low, trembling voice that the letter was written by the woman he once loved, a woman he had promised never to abandon, and it was meant to be opened only under a specific circumstance, one he had never imagined would come to pass. His hands shook as he explained that he had avoided this moment for years, carrying the letter with him like a final heartbeat of something he could not bury. Helena watched him struggle, and something inside her ached with recognition, the terror of confronting a truth you've carried too long, the fear that understanding it might break you anew. When he admitted that he had come to the hospital not because of the cold or the injury, but because he was finally ready, or desperate enough, to face whatever the letter held, Helena felt the room shift into a stillness so profound it bordered on sacred. She told him softly that he didn't have to read it alone, and although the offer was quiet, almost whispered, it seemed to strike Elias with an intensity that startled him. For a moment he hesitated, torn between the instinct to protect himself and the impulse to trust her, this stranger who somehow felt less like a stranger with every passing hour. But before he could decide, another sound broke the fragile silence, the sudden, sharp buzz of her hospital pager. A critical patient, an emergency. Reality surged back in like a harsh winter wind. Helena stood reluctantly, feeling the invisible thread between them stretch thin as she apologized, promising she would return as soon as she could. Elias tried to say that it was fine, that he understood, but the flicker of disappointment in his eyes made it clear that something inside him had almost been ready to unravel, and now had tightened again out of self-preservation. As Helena hurried through the dim corridors, her heart pulsed with a strange urgency, not just the urgency of her duties, but the urgency of knowing that she had left Elias alone with a truth that had waited years to be unleashed. She found herself thinking of him as she treated the patient, her hands working out of habit while her thoughts drifted back to the man in the room she had just left, alone, vulnerable, and holding a letter that could change the shape of his entire life. By the time she returned, the storm had finally passed, leaving a soft hush over the world. Elias sat on the edge of the bed, the envelope open beside him. His expression was unreadable, not broken, not relieved, but suspended somewhere in between, as if the words he had just read had rearranged the coordinates of his heart. When he lifted his gaze to hers, Helena felt the weight of the moment before he even spoke. "She wanted me to find someone who could stay," he whispered, and in that instant Helena understood that the night was no longer just about a letter, or a confession, or even a past that refused to stay silent. It was about the first fragile step toward choosing what came next. For a long moment after Elias spoke, Helena felt as if the air itself had thickened, as though the world outside the small hospital room had fallen into a breathless pause. Dawn was still a distant promise, and the fading storm clouds cast the room in muted blue-gray shadows, softening the sharp lines of everything except the raw honesty in his eyes. He seemed smaller somehow, not in stature, but in the way vulnerability reshaped a person, as if the truth he had finally unsealed had drained a weight he had carried for too many years, leaving him exposed and trembling at the edge of something unknown. Helena stepped closer, her movements gentle, as if afraid any sudden sound might cause him to collapse back into himself. Elias held the open letter in his fingers, smoothing its creased edges with a kind of reverence, as though the act of touching it kept him tethered to the past, even as he struggled to let it go. When he finally spoke again, his voice carried the fragile sincerity of a man wrestling with grief and possibility at once. The woman he had loved, the one who wrote the letter, had known she was dying long before he understood how sick she was. In her final days, she had written not a plea for him to stay tethered to her memory, but a plea for him to live again after she was gone. Helena listened with a depth of attention she rarely allowed herself, not out of duty, but out of recognition. The recognition of someone learning that the love they clung to was not meant to be a cage, but a door they had been too afraid to open. Elias confessed how he had mistranslated her silence into abandonment, how his sorrow had hardened into a ritual he repeated every holiday season, returning to town, carrying the letter, unable to read it, afraid of the freedom it might demand of him. His eyes flickered up to hers with a trembling uncertainty, as if asking whether it was acceptable to feel both relief and guilt all at once. Helena felt the weight of his confession like a tide pulling at her, drawing her into a current she had not expected when the night began. She sat beside him, close enough for their shoulders to nearly touch, and told him softly, almost reluctantly, that grief was not loyalty, and letting go did not erase what had been real. Her words seemed to strike something tender in him, loosening a tightness in his breath. Yet in the silence that followed, she sensed another struggle rising, one not rooted in the past, but in the present. He was now aware of her presence, not merely as a doctor, not merely as a witness, but as someone he could lean toward if he dared to. The truth frightened them both. Elias turned slightly, studying her in a way that blended gratitude with an emotion neither of them had the courage to name. Helena felt a quiet panic flutter beneath her ribs, not because she feared him, but because she feared how much she wanted him to stay in this moment. She had built her life upon distance, upon control, upon keeping her heart protected behind the sterile calm of hospital corridors. And yet here she was, feeling everything she had fought so long to numb. As the storm clouds finally thinned and a pale slice of starlight emerged, Elias whispered that he didn't know who he was without his grief, without the ritual of waiting. Helena, with a steadiness that surprised even herself, told him that perhaps this night, this impossible, fragile night, was the beginning of learning, that healing did not have to be loud, that sometimes it began quietly in the presence of someone who did not demand anything except truth. He looked at her then, really looked, and for the first time since she had met him, his expression held not sorrow, not confusion, but the barest glimmer of hope, a hope so subtle she almost doubted she had seen it, but it was there, trembling like a lantern in deep winter. Helena felt something inside her shift in answer. For a moment that stretched beyond time, they sat side by side, the letter resting between them like a bridge, no longer a barrier, and though neither reached for the other, the space between their hands felt charged, not with urgency, but with an understanding that this night had already changed both of them in ways they had not intended and were not yet ready to name. Outside, the first faint signs of dawn began to color the sky, and before either could speak again, they knew the night was not over, but it was no longer the same night it had been when it began. Dawn approached slowly, as though the world itself hesitated before letting the night end. Soft gold spilled across the horizon, brushing the snow-dusted streets with a pale shimmer that made everything appear fragile, newly formed. Helena stood near the wide hospital window, her fingers resting lightly against the cold glass, watching the faint glow deepen. Behind her, the steady hum of machines and muffled footsteps of early shift nurses felt distant, like noises from another life she had briefly stepped out of during the long, strange night she and Elias had shared. She felt hollowed out in a way that was not painful, but cleansing, as though the hours between midnight and morning had cleared a space inside her she never realized had grown so numb. Elias joined her quietly, the letter folded neatly and tucked into his coat pocket. No longer something he feared to touch. His posture had changed, subtly but unmistakably. He stood straighter, no longer bowed by memories he had carried alone for years. When he spoke her name, his voice held a softness she had not heard from him before, not the tremor of grief, nor the tightness of sorrow, but a tentative warmth, like someone learning to speak again after months of silence. He told her he was leaving the town at sunrise, not to run from the past, but because he finally felt he could walk without being chased by it. Helena tried to respond with the calm professionalism she had worn for so long, but her words faltered. She realized with a quiet shock that she did not want him to go, not yet, not like this, not after what they had begun to uncover in each other. The instinct to hold back, to remain distant, tugged at her like an old habit, reminding her of every moment she had chosen her work, her order, her solitude over anything uncertain. But the night had changed her. Elias had changed her, and beneath the fear there was now a tenderness she could no longer justify hiding behind rational explanations. Elias stepped closer, studying her with the same gentle clarity with which he had read the letter hours earlier. He admitted He didn't know what the future looked like, for him, for her, for anything beyond this moment. But he also confessed that for the first time in years, he wanted to find out, not alone, not anchored to sorrow, but with eyes open to whatever might come. His honesty felt like a warm pulse against her still guarded heart, loosening something she had long believed would stay locked away. Helena looked at him then, truly looked, and saw a man who had chosen to release the ghost that held him in place, a man who had discovered that survival and living were not the same thing. She felt the truth rise in her chest, quiet but steady. She wanted him to stay, even if only for one more day, one more morning, one more breath of possibility. Her voice trembled as she asked him if he was leaving because he felt he must, or because he believed she wouldn't want him to remain. The question seemed to suspend the air between them. Elias exhaled slowly, almost in disbelief, and said he had assumed she would prefer distance, that doctors lived in worlds of structure and light, beyond the reach of men who walked through life with old shadows in their hands. Helena did not step toward him, and she did not step away. Instead, she offered something braver, the truth she had avoided even from herself. She told him that this night had been the first in years when she felt her heart move, not violently, not fearfully, but with quiet recognition, as if something finally aligned. In the stillness that followed, neither reached for the other, yet something intimate passed between them, an unspoken promise that did not need touch to exist. Elias's expression softened, and the faintest smile, unsure, hopeful, formed on his lips. It was enough. It was more than enough. A nurse entered, calling Helena's name, grounding the moment back into the world. Elias looked toward the door, then back at her, and whispered that he would return that evening if she wanted him to. No pressure, no expectation, only a choice, offered gently, like a gift. Helena felt the warmth rise in her chest again and nodded, unable to speak as the morning light finally reached the room, bathing them both in soft gold. For a brief second they stood suspended in that glow, two people no longer defined by their old wounds, but by the courage to imagine that the night they shared was not the end, but the beginning of a life where connection did not terrify them. As Elias walked down the corridor, and the first star of the night faded behind the brightening sky, Helena understood something with startling clarity. Some stories do not need grand declarations to change a life. Sometimes it takes only one night, one truth, one choice made at dawn. And when she turned back toward the window, the light felt different, warmer, fuller, as if the day ahead was no longer something to endure, but something she was finally ready to step into.
Thank you for listening. I'm grateful you chose to spend this time here. New stories arrive every week, and I hope you'll return for the next one.